Hello, hello, and welcome to Temple of the Falls Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Bruce.
This is I know that the folks at home can't see this, but this is the third consecutive week when we've had a chance to podcast face to face. We're actually sitting at my dining room table podcasting, and the most important part of what I just said is that we are sitting face to face.
Which is not only rare when we're podcasting, but it's rare when we're playing Magic too. Usually I'm directly next to you.
Yeah, we tend to try and avoid sitting directly opposite each other, and we'll get into that through the course of the show because
It's my shiny forehead, isn't it?
That was a shot across the bow, folks. Shot across the bow.
But that kind of gets to the point of today's episode, which is going to be sitting and seating and seats and chairs and sit, sat, sut.
Sure. Something most people, something virtually no one thinks about when they're playing Magic is where you're seated. Where you're seated has a dramatic effect. Okay, you know what? That's a little overstated. Where you're seated has a significant impact on the way your game is going to go. I'm looking at it more from a Magic perspective. Essentially, when you go over to a friend's house to play, or when you used to do that, or maybe you're back doing that now, but when you play face-to-face with other people, especially for Commander games or other multiplayer Magic games, you're all sitting around a table. And because Magic is a game based on turn order, where you sit really does have a significant effect on the game. And we're going to go into that. Ideally, what I wanted to talk about was first about the physical aspect of where you're sitting. And then we would spend the second half talking more about how that affects the gameplay itself, where you're seated, what your turn order is, and where to go from there. So that's sort of the map for today's today's podcast.
The nice literal versus metaphorical, I guess not metaphorical, figurative where you're seated.
Yes, we're going to speak to literal and literally figuratively.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To me, the physical aspect really ties more into the level of fun you're going to have in the game. So when I say physical, let's start with the most basic of physical aspect is the chair itself. One of the first groups that I ever played with, we would go over to a friend's place, and they had this big table in the middle of a bedroom. Now, this was 4 buddies who were all renting a place together. We were all in our very early 20s, and some people were in their late teens. And they had this larger table in a smaller bedroom. And surrounding the table were all the chairs. And this is where we played Magic. And let me tell you, it got freaking hot in that room because there was one stupid window and we were on the second floor. But that's not the point. The point is you learned to come early because while there were 6 chairs in that room, 4 of them could hold your weight comfortably. And the other 2 had cracks. One had a crack in the seat, which was guaranteed to pinch your butt at some point during the course of the night. And the other one had a crack in one of the legs of the chair. So you sat.
So you're looking for the crack chair.
Well, you sat poised,
get goosed,
leaning towards the three solid legs for the entire night. This was just not comfortable. And you say to yourself, well, why didn't they just get better chairs? And that's a valid point, but they didn't.
I mean, you're in your early 20s. Of course you're not going to get better chairs. Why would you?
Well, most of the chairs in the room were lawn chairs. They were literally plastic piles of crap. But some of them were broke and some of them weren't. So you learn to come early just to get a decent chair to sit in. This directly affects how much fun you're having playing Magic. if you're spending half of your time perched on a chair that really has 3 legs. So that's about as fundamental as it gets. But for, practically speaking, there's also what I like to refer to as the chair that is near beer. Now, it doesn't have to be beer. Essentially, it's the chair next to something that everybody wants.
The near beer chair.
Right. Now, where we play here, I have a beer fridge in my dining room. And the person who sits near that fridge is the one who's essentially assigned to provide liquid to everybody else.
I gotta change my seating arrangement.
There
That is my seat. I sit there.
Right. Now, obviously, this varies. For some people, it's an annoyance that they have to reach in and grab beer or, in my case, Coca-Cola or whatever other beverage people want. And for other people, it's a much better plan because that means they don't have to constantly ask for it. So I guess it depends on you.
A politics game.
And it depends a little bit on you. If you're also using, Ashnod's coupon?
Oh, yeah.
Being the player nearest to the beer is generally where you want to be because it involves the least amount of effort.
It's funny because these specific chairs as well, these are like deep seated dining chairs.
Yeah.
So when you're playing Magic, you're kind of not sitting on the edge, but like I don't know, like my butt's like, I don't know how much I want to talk about my butt on this podcast, but you're kind of like seated like halfway up the chair. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is like during things like BrewCon where you're sitting in this chair for 12, 14 hours a day.
Right.
I remember getting up and the next day the back of my thighs have like this like bruise on it just from like I'm like, oh man, like was I really seated for that long? And like, yeah, like Magic games can go long, especially Commander.
Right.
So like you want to make sure that you get comfy.
Exactly. And I mean, we're talking about, this is where I play most of my Magic is in the dining room and the chairs in here are just fine. But for those of us...
Oh, yeah, no, they're comfortable.
Yeah, but for those of us who, for others who play most of their games at, say, your local card store, where you're most likely seated in a plastic folding chair, where you sit down and you can feel the 4 legs spread out just a little. And yes, I happen to be 6'4", 250 pounds, so yes... The chairs do give a little when I sit on them.
Oh yeah, me too. I'm 6'4". You can.
There we go.
I'm only 250 pounds too.
Given the average gamer, this can be an issue, and it's and it does affect the enjoyment of the game. I guess the other part is the shape of the table itself. Can definitely, I think, affects the way the game is played. I know of, I think the easiest comparison for me is Gen Con. Well, it wasn't Gen Con. It was PAX East when I noticed it. At PAX, the first couple of days, we were playing at the standard tables. The rectangular folding tables that
are just wide enough to put 2 play mats.
Right. During Magic tournaments, they squeeze 3 players to a side, and then when you're playing casually, you use the appropriate 2 players per side because these tables are just not that big, and Commander games take up more space. But
it's the tokens.
Exactly. But what I discovered was, with a square table, when you've got 4 players, it's 2 on one side and 2 on the other, and you're invariably facing directly against one person, and then the two other players are sitting either on your left or right, in a square formation.
Oh yeah, so like one on each
corner.
Yeah,
it's a square.
Yeah.
The problem is with a square table, you are invariably more likely to attack the person seated directly across from you. It's just the way it is. Now, that can be for a variety of reasons. You can more easily see what they're playing. The person sitting across from you likely either just had their turn or is about to have their turn. So you are fully aware of exactly what they've done, what their defenses are, what their strengths are. You are more likely to see them as the primary threat just because of the, how they're first and foremost in your mind. Now, I'm not saying that, you always attack the person who sits across from you. Obviously, that's not the case. I mean, if there's, if there's a primary threat that's significant, I'm talking about a situation where when everything is virtually equal, not perfectly, but close to it, you're more likely to attack the person across from you.
Oh, okay. So we're talking like 2 and 2 on either side. Okay, I thought. Gotcha.
Yeah.
For some reason, I was picturing it like 1, 1, 1, and 1, like.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting too, especially where you've got the things you said, and then you've got the fact that the person 2 away from you, the person diagonal, is diagonal, so they're
right.
Essentially further away, so it's like harder to keep an eye out. You can't like perfectly see the cards. Maybe there's a bit of glare.
Right. Now, if you happen to end up in a 5-player game at a square table, then you likely have the same square formation, but then you're going to have one more person who is sitting at either the end or the head of the table. So now that one person doesn't have anybody who's sitting directly across from them. All they have are the 2 players that are nearest to them, and then the 2 players that are farther away from them.
Yeah.
So it creates an uneven balance in the game, because the player at the head of the table is then mostly looking at the 2 players sitting closest to them.
Yeah.
And then there are the 2 players that are farther away. To actually see what's going on over there, you have to get up out of your chair and go look, or at least get up and lean. You have to make a comment and say, what do you have on the table? Or how many cards are in your graveyard, without just being able to look and see. This all affects.
Yeah, it's the diagonal problem with the square too.
Exactly.
There are obviously ways to counterbalance this in terms of gameplay. Obviously, you can have people read their cards fully when they play them, which I would highly recommend regardless of this situation.
Exactly.
But then there are also like variants that you can play, and depending on how I edit and release this episode, we will have already talked about it, or will talk about it either earlier or later in this season. And so you've got things like Star, or Tack Left, or whatever, and it makes it easier to understand to not just do the easy thing because they're closer.
Right, and it keeps the balance to the game.
Yeah.
But without that, there's this lack of equilibrium in the game.
Right.
Now, that's the square table. Let's put everybody at the round table. Now you've got, even if you've only got 4 players, you have 2 players facing each other, and then 2 players facing each other, and they're all at 90-degree angles to each other. As opposed to sitting next to somebody and then having 2 players on the other side of the table.
Right.
It just becomes so much easier to see everything.
Yeah.
The opponent that you're sitting across from, you can see their cards. The opponents that are sitting on either side, you can see their cards. It makes things so much easier. I think you are still a little more likely to swing at the person across from you, but maybe not, because you've got a better balance of knowledge of what everybody's playing.
I think too, with like a circle, or even like a square rather than a rectangle, where you do have that 1 and 1 and 1 and 1, like the person across from you has changed.
Right.
It's a different position in the turn order. Rather than the person directly before or after you, you are now looking at the person away from you.
The person across from you is now the second person in order.
And kind of with the shape of the table also kind of comes the size of the table.
Yeah.
I've sat at tables that have been plenty too large. Some would say that this table that we're sitting at now
Right.
might be too big, but it's also a dining room table that comfortably seats 6.
Yeah.
You could have a plastic folding table that comfortably seats 4, and it's the perfect size.
Right.
And so, like, with the shape comes the size, and who knows exactly why you'd be more inclined to attack the person sitting across from you, or, like, whether it's at a rectangle, square, or circle. But it seems to show up more consistently that way. My guess is probably because you're just like default resting head position. You're staring at them. But who knows?
Right. And the other part of this, if you make the game if you're playing a 5-player game and you're now at a round table, there is no one directly opposite you. You're in a star shape and everybody is facing inward. So, if you're going to default to attacking anybody, it's going to be either the person on your left or your right.
Yeah.
However, the entire table is more likely to be within view. Is much more like you're more likely to be aware of what everybody's playing because the relative distance between them is less. I think you're less likely to get any kind of a glare issue. A round table is just going to be a better setup. That's not generally an option.
Right.
When you're playing, you're either at a square table or you're a square or rectangle, or you're at a round table. You don't get the choice. I'm just saying that, given the options, you should keep in mind where you're about to sit.
Yeah.
When you're playing,
and kind of with thinking about where you're going to sit. Obviously, we've talked about the physical dimensions and thickness and material of the chair, but beyond that, where you sit is this idea of turn order. Because I think, especially now that a lot of us are playing on Spell Table virtually, there is more emphasis on that. Granted, with Spell Table, you can do it randomly.
Right.
But if you are to be able to pick your position in the turn order, there's some nuance to it, or at least some consequence to where you are in the turn order.
Right.
And we're going to talk about that when we get back from break. But I think it's about time. You got one more thing.
Give me one more.
All right.
This is a quick one. 1 minute. Ideally, you want your back to the wall. The benefit of having your back to the wall is that it's much harder for random error. Meaning, when somebody gets up to go get a pizza, they don't accidentally glance at your hand. I am not going to suggest that anybody is looking to cheat in a game of Commander. Because, let's be honest, as my good friend Kyle says, if you need to cheat in this game, then you know what? You go ahead. I don't need it that bad. But if you're sitting against the wall, nobody's walking behind you.
Yeah.
Nobody's seeing anything. This is another physical setup. It's not always the case, but it can certainly set up that way.
I think more along the lines of physical parameters too. You've got things like don't box yourself in. Like if you're for whatever reason playing at like a booth in like a restaurant type situation, it's like, if you have to get somebody else, if you're one to use the bathroom a lot, like sometimes I am, maybe don't sit all the way inside the room. Like be close to the exit if you need to be. Things to consider, because otherwise you're going to be like, I don't want to bug anybody, and then you're going to hold it, and then you're going to play worse because you're under more stress. And
this is following that. This is exactly the reason why I almost always sit in the same chair when we play Magic at my house. It's because it's the chair closest to the kitchen. I want to be able to get up, do some quick prep on whatever pizza or whatever other meal we happen to be doing, and I don't want to have to walk past everybody else to get there. It's just, I don't want to...
You can slip in and out easily.
Exactly.
And I sit next to you so that when I go behind you, I can see exactly what cards you're playing.
There we go. This is what I'm talking about. So, anyways. So
that he doesn't do a good job hiding his hand. Anyway.
I do not do a good job hiding
I
my
also
hand.
don't cheat. That would be absurd. But yeah, so we'll talk more about the turn order when we get back from our break. But for right now, let's turn it over to our ad, which is sure to spark some giggles. Because, I don't know. All right, be right back.
This episode of Temple of False Pod is brought to you by Entirely Normal Armchair. Because really, other than Seat of the Synod, what other card was it going to be? Entirely Normal Armchair for all your seating needs. Back to you, Andy.
Oh, thank you. I will take it. Welcome back. We are... If you forgot, we're Temple of the False Pod. We're talking about seating today. Spectator seating, Seat of the Synod. These were all ideas for our ad. But what you heard was the beautiful mind of Bruce Richard.
You're welcome.
So, we've already talked about the physicality of sitting. Bent waists, bent knees, comfortable. Now, the more impactful, not to say that none of that impacts the game. It does. That was the point. What is more impactful and what is more seen under, honestly, the rules of Magic is the turn order. So there are things that if you were to choose the ideal turn order to figure out where to sit down, because where you sit impacts the turn order, obviously, and with that comes an ideal progression. What's the word? Sequence.
Yeah.
Comes an ideal sequence of who comes before you, who comes after you, who's diagonal to you, and so with that, not that you want to optimize literally every second of the game, but honestly, the fun of the game can change dramatically depending on
where you're sitting. Now, before we get any farther, I am going to say, let's start with the person who's seated on your right, the person who's playing before you. The best example of this was, at least for me, was in this play group. This was before Andy came along.
Long ago.
One of the guys in the group was named Josh. Josh was always one of the first ones here. And Josh invariably would come in, we'd chat for a bit, and he would sit down in the seat next to me. Now, he liked that seat because you could see everybody as they come in. So it was a little more welcoming. It also meant that there weren't people walking around you all the time, because that particular seat is close to the fridge and it's closer to the corner of the room. So it was just a little more comfortable for him to sit there.
Honestly, that's probably why I sit there.
Right. And I'm sure it was why Josh sat there. However, Josh was always one of the better players in the group, and a lot of his decks were very responsive to what the rest of the group was doing. Mm-hmm. The benefit for me was that because I played immediately after him, most people were looking at what Josh had just done. Usually, if he had a big play, it was something that would stick with players. So I would then get to play a turn that was particularly good too. But everyone was focused on what Josh had done because he had done it just before me. So sitting to my right worked well for me. Josh often also played with counterspells. And that also worked well for me because if I did something that was particularly dangerous, he then had to decide, do I use my counterspell now and not have anything for the next two players? Or do I wait with the expectation that one of those two players is going to have something that's worse than what I just played?
Right. You don't want to end up kicking yourself, being like, I shouldn't have countered whatever Bruce did because somebody else did something worse, and now I don't have that counter spell.
So this always worked well for me. And then for whatever reason, Josh stopped being the first one there and decided the better place for him to be seated was diagonally from me. Because apparently, at the end of his turn, I quite often would play something that would directly affect what he had just done. And I could do this because my turn was coming up. I had the extra mana. I could play however I chose.
Yeah.
And since I knew that Josh was generally the strongest player on the board, a lot of times I would wait and then be able to make my move then. When he moved to a different seat, it forced me to play differently, and it allowed him to do different things.
World turned upside down, Bruce.
Turned upside down. And nothing really changed. We played the same decks. We're playing against the same opponents. The only thing that changed was where he was sitting. So it does make a difference.
Even like with regards to counters, we've talked about playing like if the person who plays a lot of counters is right before you, and if they're diagonal. Now, there have been times where I've had a lot of counters, say, in my Pirates deck. And I know that personally, to the people that I play against, I am a little newer to the game. I still struggle with when to counter things and when to let them resolve, whether it is the ideal move or, in general, because of Commander EDH reasons, like letting the big plays sometimes resolve. Like, sometimes you just want to do that because you don't get those plays outside of Commander. And so if you are figuring out where to sit comparatively to the player who plays a lot of counters, I know that as a younger player, I have gone whole rounds around the board and then realized I'm still holding up counter mana, and so it gets to the person right before me, and I'm like, well, I got to use it now, otherwise I'm gonna have to hold it up again, and then I'm essentially down 2 mana or whatever.
Right. Now, to be fair, the standard response to this is then don't use the counter.
Right.
Obviously, you want to use it on spells that you think are actually the threat. Now, if the person on your left plays a threat and you deem it significant enough that you should counter it, the only reason not to is if you think somebody else is going to play something even worse. And that becomes a case of how well you know your opponents, how well you know their decks, the likelihood of that actually happening. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you when to play counters. That's way beyond what we're talking about right now.
It's way beyond what we're talking about right now. It's way beyond kind of our periphery of Magic in itself. But also, like, I guess to tie it back in, if you know of a player in your playgroup who is counter heavy, maybe don't sit to the right of them.
Right. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where the person who is more likely to play counter spells, and when I say counter spells, it doesn't even need to be counter spells. It can be counter spells. It can be the person who is most likely to play with cards that can respond to what other people do.
Yeah.
You don't want to
removal,
be, right. You don't want to be to their right.
Right.
Because at that point, they're looking at the mana they've got on the board and thinking, I'm wasting it. Now, it can be even worse if it's something that's on the table and it genuinely is a waste if they don't use the mana. The thing is that if your opponent has a card on the table that allows them to spend mana and just get something for it, and it doesn't even cost them a card, well, then it doesn't matter whether they're a good player or a bad player. They're going to use it. And more often than not, it's going to get used on you because they've now run out of options. Nobody did anything that they especially didn't want damaged. So now they get their choice and they target you or your spell or whatever. And that's simply a product of you being in that seat. If you were in a different seat, you would not be suffering in that same way.
With that example, like what do you have like a specific card in mind, or Like a type of card? Like a permanent that does a thing that would only be helpful.
There's, one of the cards I used in a previous Temple's Treasure is Douse. Douse is an older card, and it's an enchantment, and it says you spend 1 and a blue, and it counters target red spell. Mm-hmm. Now, you get around that by playing other cards that can change the name, but if you want to know more about that, go check out that podcast. But a card like Douse is sitting there, and if there are 2 players at your table that are playing red spells, well, your opponent has, the player who has the Douse has 2 mana up. The player who plays immediately after that, after the Douse player, plays a red spell. It's sort of concerning, but not too bad. Well, I'm going to let that one go, because I only have 2 mana up, and I want to save it for something especially bad. So then everybody else gets to go, and then your turn, you're the last one up before the Douse player, and you play a red spell. And it doesn't even matter what it is. It can be a complete piece of garbage. Well, now that Douse player is looking at it going, well, I can counter that, and there's really no downside, because that's what I got. The only restriction I have is maybe he's got another red spell. He doesn't. So he counters your crappy spell. He should have countered the other guys, but he didn't know. He didn't know what you were going to play. So he waited on it, and now he's stuck countering any red spell that you play. It's just a product of where you were seated. It's just lousy, but that's sort of...
Yeah.
That's how it goes.
Yeah. And I think even, like I had mentioned earlier, like, it's hard to structure, I guess, hard to sequence turn order when so much is being done digitally lately.
Right.
Where it can be randomized, it isn't necessarily, like, you have... but
yeah, and like you said, with the randomization that you get from Spell Table, to me, it takes that part of it away, and it takes that piece of negative away, because you can restructure the table.
Yeah.
Like restructure the turn order after every game. So maybe you had some rotten luck, and when you came in, you sat down, you didn't know what your friend was going to play. You found out what deck he was going to play, and you were just like, oh, I can't believe I'm stuck in this seat. And this isn't always a case of, the one where, you don't want to be to the right of this person. There are times when you don't want to be the left of the person either. It's a little less often.
I think along those same lines too, I think like generally it is hard to not necessarily predict, but control not only where you're sitting physically at the table, like in turn order, but where in turn order you come, because I think if you're first, it has all these benefits, but also like, say you're playing like a white deck that's running like Land Tax and Knight of the Accord and Knight of the White Blossom, what is it?
Knight of the White Orchid.
Knight of the White Orchid. Like these cards that are hinging on you being slightly behind. But if you're first, it's really hard to get cards like Land Tax to do literally anything. You either have to take a turn off to get behind if you're first, or
you're relying on the ramp guy to give you his thing. The other one is it's a lot more narrow, but it fits into what we were talking about with the counterspell. Picture the type of cards. The ones that really stick out to me are the tempt cards and other cards of that ilk. So the opponent on your right plays one of the tempt cards, say the green one.
So we've got tempt with discovery.
Yeah.
I don't have the card up right now, but essentially the card reads something along the lines of, starting with you go find a land card. Then the next person in turn order can decide to go find a land card. But if they do, you then get to go find another land card. And it goes around the table until it gets back to you.
Yeah. So if Andy plays tempt with discovery, and I'm the next person up, everybody should know by now that these sort of cards, they're never good for you. The opponent who's running the card in the deck is going to find better land than you. And they're going to find a ton more of it if you even go to look for one. So you should never take the offer. Well, okay, maybe never's too strong, but you should almost never take the offer. Now, sitting just to the left of Andy, if I say no, if I say yes, I am essentially saying to everybody else at the table, we're all going to say yes. Because I've already said yes, which means Andy's getting 2 cards. The other 2 players have a choice. They're not going to get anything, or they can at least each match up with what I got.
Right. So rather than having the player who played the card get 2 ahead, everyone's getting 1 more ahead. And
right. So everybody gets 1, except for Andy, who gets a bunch. Now, the other way is I can play it properly and say, no, I'm going to pass. And then that way, Andy only gets 1 land. And that's really what we're looking for here. I mean, Template Discovery costs 4. He really wants at least 2 lands to make this worthwhile. Now, so if I say no, I get nothing. Andy still only gets 1 card. Now, if the next person over says yes, well, now I didn't get anything. Andy gets 2. That guy gets 1. And we're still waiting to see what the next guy does. So Andy could get 3. They each get 1, and I get nothing. This is the danger of sitting to the left of the person who has the tempting offer. Now, that also works with, what was it? Yeah, Browbeat. Browbeat says any player may have Browbeat deal 5 damage to him or her. If no one does, target player draws 3 cards. So this is just the reverse. So now if Andy plays the Browbeat, as the first player up, I have a choice. I can take 5 damage or let Andy draw 3. Well, I should take the 5 damage because we don't want Andy to draw 3. But I'm looking at the next 2 players on the table, and I'm like, well, it's not really my problem. One of you guys should have to take the damage. I'm going to pass. So the next person up gets the same scenario and thinks to themselves, there's still 1 guy sitting over there. I'm going to pass.
Yeah.
Well, now the last guy, the one sitting to the right.
Pressure's all on him.
The pressure is all on him, and it always will be for these kinds of cards. Because one person has to take the hit.
Yeah.
Or the guy draws 3.
I think it's funny, too, because with the tempting offer situation, it's like the person to the right... Like, we've played enough tempting offer cards that I know there's generally no discussion around it when it finally hits the battlefield. So, people won't say anything. And if you're the last person to choose and everybody said no, you can just say yes. And, like, you're essentially screwing over
you've just become that guy.
And, like... If you're not having a conversation about it, then nobody can blame you.
Right.
I mean, they can, but
right. And Browbeat, what I just described with the last person being the one who really should be taking the 5 damage to prevent the 3 cards.
Mm-hmm.
There are times when that's not necessarily the case. I mean,
right.
Obviously, if
you have the 5 to spare, might as well.
If you have the 5 damage to spare, then yes, go ahead. If the person who's trying to draw the 3 cards is there's 3 of you and you're all playing against one person who's way ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then that one person who's way ahead is the one who's going to pay the 5 damage because the other guys are not going to pay for it. They want you to draw the cards. So, so obviously maybe it's not the person on the right if they kind of want the guy to draw the cards. But all things equal, being the person who's sitting on the right to the guy who's playing Browbeat or other cards like it, you're going to be the one who's expected to take the hit over and over again. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover.
Okay.
It's just, again, virtually everything we've described here is stuff that you can't know until you sit down. Like, you don't know what deck your opponent is playing. you may have a general idea of what kind of a player they are, and maybe you can make assumptions based on that. You certainly can't control whether or not you're sitting at a round or a square table. Odds are, if you're going to a friend's house, you probably don't even get to choose where you're sitting anyway, unless you're the first one there. There's all sorts of, I've described all this, and obviously we're also talking about edge cases.
Right.
A lot of this is running on the assumption that everything else is equal. Well, once your 4 turns into a commander game, it's no longer equal. So a lot of what I've talked about doesn't factor in.
Right.
But it's there.
Yeah.
It is there.
I think it's, yeah.
And I know it's there. Like I said, my friend Josh literally moved seats because he recognized, well, we both did. We recognized the way the gameplay was going, and we're curious to see how it would change if we were seated in different areas in relation to each other, and it did change.
Yeah.
So this does have an effect. It may not be every turn all the time. It's not overwhelming, but it's there, and it does happen.
Yeah. It's interesting because we were talking counters earlier, but that it's not just counters, it's instant speed removal. I mean, like, counters are, in a broad sense, instant speed removal, but where you sit has this effect on how you play, but also how your opponents play.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing to take away from this is you can't really optimize any of this. And, like, that's not the point of bringing your attention to it.
No, it's not the point of a casual commander game to look to be optimizing your seat position.
Like, if I just, bring a seat cushion, maybe I'll play better. Or if I pee before the game, like, I'll play better. Which, like, yeah, absolutely. Go pee before you play it, because you're going to be interrupting the game if you get up. And I think just sit down and play. Don't overthink it. And if you catch yourself overthinking it, I mean, we brought this to your attention because it affects the game, and that's it. If you know it's there, you can hopefully use it to have it affect you and your playing less. Just sit down and play.
Yeah.
Just have fun. Go talk with your friends. Go eat pizza. Go drink beer. Go get your friend's beer. Go drink
your friend's beer.
Go drink your friend's beer. Shake up your friend's beer and then give it to them. Don't do that. That would be mean, because then you'll get their cards.
Well, that's the joy of being at the near beer seat.
Yeah. That's why I double sleeve my cards, Bruce.
Right.
Yeah, no. That's all we want. Just be comfortable.
Yeah. Mind your seat.
Yeah. Speaking of going to the bathroom before we play, I'm going to go to the bathroom, and then we're going to play some Magic.
Excellent.
So, we got to head out. That's going to do it for us here at Temple of the False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays, sure as heck, are comfortable and fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
We'll see you next week. Have a great night, and may your 5th land be the temple.
Bye!
Hey everyone, Andy here. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Temple of the False Pod. Just a few housekeeping things here at the end of the show. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, pretty much wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe and give us a review. It really helps out the show. And it'll show us what you like about our podcast. Also, we've got a Twitter and an Instagram. Our handle is FalsePodMTG, all one word. So be sure to follow us. Feel free to reach out to us there or drop us an email at falsepodmtg@gmail.com and tell us your favorite Magic-related story. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again to you and to Bruce. He's Mana Burned on Twitter, and I'm Andy Weekend on Twitter and Twitch. We're Temple of the False Pod, where our decks aren't optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. Have a great night, and may your 5th land be the temple.